The first thing Karen felt was the earth. Not as an image, not as a memory, but literally the damp, heavy, living earth under his palm, into which he had pressed his face after falling. Then came the smell. Wet moss, rotten leaves, iron-rich water, and smoke somewhere very close. Chiron opened his eyes. A forest stood above him. Not the kind of forest found in city parks or on tourist trails. A real one, ancient, dense, with crooked trunks and crowns that barely let light through. The branches hung low as if watching. Misty strips stretched between the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a bird hooted, one he did not know, but for some reason immediately did not want to meet. He sat up with difficulty. The clothes were unfamiliar. Rough, made of thick fabric with leather patches on the elbows. A knife on the belt? Not beautiful, not ceremonial, but working. A sack nearby. Inside the sack, things turned out to be even more interesting. Rope, flint, iron nails, a small hatchet, a mug, a coil of dry thread, a fire striker, an iron spoon, and a bundle with bread that had already begun to go stale. Karen stared at all of it with an expression as if someone had placed before him starter inventory from a game he loved too much. Then he remembered. The last thing in his previous life had not been pain, not death, not even fear. A monitor. Karen had been sitting at night in his one-room apartment, finishing cold tea and getting stuck in a survival strategy game that he was playing through for the third time because he wanted to build the perfect base without unnecessary mistakes. He played games where everything was made from scratch, from a hut to a fortress, from a well to a wall, from a stove to an entire settlement. He did not love fights. He loved it when the system worked. When stone became a foundation, when a campfire became a kitchen, when a temporary shelter became a home, when a home became a city. And now he was lying in a forest, somewhere in a world that clearly was not Earth. He slowly rose to his feet. There was a strange feeling in his chest, not panic, but a very familiar excitement. If this is a new world, then at least I have an advantage. He looked around more carefully. The forest was beautiful, but it was the kind of beauty that was respected only until the first hunger. The soil was swampy in some places, rocky in others. That means there is water. Good wood. That is important. Without wood, you cannot build. Without water, you cannot survive. Without stone, you cannot fortify. Karen raised his head and noticed a path. Faint, barely visible, but real. There are people here, he smiled. Excellent. That means there is someone to build a kingdom from. By evening, Karen had already understood 3 things. First, he was not in the capital and not near it. Second, he did not know the language fully, but understood it in fragments, as if the body he had entered had already heard the local speech before. It was convenient. Third, in this world it was impossible to survive simply by having knowledge. Here, knowledge had to be quickly turned into objects. He chose a place for the first night without long hesitation. A small clearing by a slope. On one side, a stone scree. On the other, dense trees. A stream nearby. Good. This was not a base forever, but it was ideal for a start. In games, he would have marked such a site as a temporary development point. First, shelter. Chiron gathered long, straight branches, stripped the bark from thinner ones, made a frame in the shape of a slanted lean-to, and reinforced it with dry vines. He laid spruce branches, moss, and bark on top. It did not turn out beautiful, but it was enough to divert rain and not lose warmth at night. Then the fire. Here he did not hurry. In games, a campfire is almost a soulless mechanic. In reality, a campfire either saves your life or gives you away to the entire forest. Chiron cleared the ground down to the soil, lined it with stones, arranged dry branches like a small hut, prepared tinder, and worked the flint. A couple of strikes of sparks, then more. The tinder began to smoke. He carefully blew on it, and only then did the flame flare up. Thin, fragile, but real. Karen exhaled with such satisfaction, as if he had just built the first wall of a fortress. He sat beside it and took the bread. Hard, almost stone-like. Fine, first survival, then comfort, then expansion. He remembered this rule better than any others. Rain came at night. The small lean-to held. He had covered the fire in advance, leaving only a small opening for warmth. Karen lay there, listened to the drops, and thought that all of this was too much like the beginning of a very long game. But in games, unlike in life, there is always an interface. There was no interface here. But there was a forest, and that was not bad either. In the morning, Chiron came out to people. More precisely, to a settlement. It was not a village in the full sense of the word, rather a group of houses surrounded by a low palisade with one common square, a forge, a well, and 3 vegetable gardens. The settlement stood at the edge of the forest but did not hide from it. That was already good. It meant the people here knew how not only to fear but also to live. 2 guards stood at the gate. Chiron raised his hands, showing that he had no weapon, and approached slowly. One of the guards tensed up immediately. The second, younger one, frowned. "Who are you?" Chiron thought for a second. Saying a man who can make your village richer would be too strange. A traveler. From where? From the south. A half-lie? But enough for now. The guards exchanged glances. Name? Chiron? Why have you come? And that was the right question. Chiron looked over the settlement again. He saw old beams by the gate, clearly half-rotten. He saw a low well with an inconvenient windlass. He saw a vegetable garden where the beds were disorderly. He saw smoke from the forge where, it seemed, the same tools were being repaired again and again. And also women by a house who were drying grain on cloths too close to the ground. He understood almost everything at once. There was no system here. There were people. There were efforts. There was no structure. This is even better than I thought. I know how to build, he said. The guard snorted. Everyone knows how to do something. I know how to make it so you have more food, warmth, and protection. Silence. The second guard, the young one, looked more closely now. Where did you get that from? Chiron smiled slightly. From experience. They took him to the elder. The elder's name was Horn. Gray-haired, broad-shouldered, with a peasant's hands and the gaze of a man who had seen too many winters. He listened to Chiron without interrupting, which already spoke better of him than any words. When he finished, Horn asked, "And what do you suggest?" Chiron immediately understood that this was his chance. First, 3 things. The well, the storehouse, defense. We have a well, but it is shallow and inconvenient. If you deepen the shaft and install a proper windlass, you will cut the time spent carrying water almost in half. Horn did not answer. Chiron continued, Your storehouse is damp. The grain spoils. The floor needs to be raised, ventilation gaps made, and everything touching the ground removed. Then the supplies will last longer. And defense? The palisade needs to be reinforced with diagonal supports, and a double gate should be made at the entrance. Right now, it can be broken down too quickly. Horn looked at him for a long time. Who taught you? Chiron almost smirked. Games. The elder did not understand, and that was normal. And what do you want to be paid with for this? He asked. Chiron answered honestly. Food, shelter, and the opportunity to work. Horn nodded, still not fully believing but already interested. If you are telling the truth, we will talk more in the evening. Better in the morning. I need to inspect the settlement. Horn narrowed his eyes. Inspect? Yes, I want to understand where your weak spots are. And if you do not like what you see, then you will have a chance to become stronger. At that, Horn unexpectedly gave a low chuckle. All right, builder, look. Chiron did not run around the village for no reason, he observed. This was an important skill, one that was often ignored in games too, and wrongly so. Before building, you need to understand the terrain. Where the wind is, where the sun is, where the water is, where the stone is, where the soil is better and where it is worse, where people work and where they waste time. He made himself a map. Not a pretty one, a working one. On a piece of thin tree bark, he marked with charcoal the well, the forge, the storehouses, the residential houses, the vegetable gardens, the forest path, the stream, the old stone ledge to the northeast. The ledge immediately drew his attention. The stone there was good, dense, suitable for foundations and fortifications. Here could be the future center. He climbed up onto the ledge closer to noon. From above, the settlement looked worse than from below. That was a good sign, because weak points are easier to see from a height. He was already beginning to mentally lay it out like a base in a game. The center, storehouse, and workshop, residential houses nearby, vegetable gardens to the south, a reserve of wood to the north, a water hub by the stream, an observation platform or future tower on the ledge. If I survive here, I can build everything. He climbed down and began looking for the first thing needed in any settlement. Not walls. A stove. A stove was needed not only for warmth. A stove means food, tools, bricks, ceramics, firing, drying, metal in the future. Without a stove, a settlement remains temporary. With a stove, it begins turning into a place where one can build for a long time. Karen knew this. The problem was that the settlement did not have a proper stove. There was a campfire hearth by the kitchen and a small clay brazier by the forge. Not enough. He went to Horn again. "We need a stove." The elder looked at him wearily. "All you do is ask, and I have only just begun. Explain." Chiron sat right on the bench beside the elder's house and began explaining the way one explains to a person who is not required to understand terms, but is required to understand the benefit. If we make a stove from stone and coat it with clay, we can dry bricks, fire pottery, and cook in large quantities. This will reduce firewood consumption and provide a place for storing food for winter. And what are bricks for? Because wood rots. Stone is heavy, but brick can be made right here. It is needed for storehouses, stoves, walls, and foundations. Horn was silent. "And how long will it take?" 3 days if you give me people and clay, and then another building. Better, and another." The elder sighed. "You speak as if you already see the entire future." Karen thought for a moment. Not all of it, but the next step, yes. Clay was dug by the stream. Karen showed how to mix it properly, remove large stones, add sand so it would not crack after drying, knead it with feet until it became uniform. At first, people watched with distrust, then with interest, and then began repeating it themselves. He did not do everything alone. That was an important difference from a lone hero. Chiron did not want to be the strongest. He wanted to build a system in which others would become more useful. The base was laid from stones by the northern slope, the body from clay and branches, the internal heat channel from fired brick, a chimney on top that carried out the heat and did not choke the room. The stove turned out rough but functional. When it was heated for the first time, steady dry heat came from it. The women immediately understood what that meant. They could dry flatbreads, roast meat, and cook twice as much. Horn silently nodded. Then he said, "This is useful." Karen wiped his hands. "I know." And at that moment, the settlement looked at him for the first time, not as a strange traveler, but as a man who could change something. The refugees came on the 6th day. At first, the guards noticed them. 5, then another 3. Then it became clear that this was not a group, but an entire stream. People with sacks, children, old people, 1 cart, and 2 exhausted horses. Faces gray from fatigue, clothes covered in dust. Someone was wounded. Horn came out to the gate personally. "From where?" "From the Eastern Valley," answered a man with a bandaged arm. "There were creatures there. First they attacked the livestock, then people. They burned the villages." Silence hung over the settlement. Karen stepped forward. "Monsters. So now there is this too." He had already understood the main thing. This was not a safe fantasy world where people simply built and traded. There was a threat here. And perhaps it would be precisely that which would force him to build faster. "How many of you?" he asked. 22. Horn looked at them, at the children, at the wounded. "We have little space." Karen was already counting mentally. "There are enough houses if we crowd in. The empty shed can be converted. The forge can be expanded temporarily. There is an unfinished barn. There is space by the northern wall." "There is enough space," he said. Horn sharply turned to him. "You do not decide. I am not the one deciding. Survival is." The elder was silent for a moment. "And where do we keep them?" Karen answered immediately. "Temporarily in the big shed and by the forge. Children and the wounded closer to the stove. The rest in village work. If they know how to do something, let them work. If not, we will teach them." "Are you sure they will not bring us problems?" Karen looked at the exhausted faces of the refugees. "The problems are already following them. The only question is whether we will be strong enough to endure them." Horn did not like giving in. That was visible, but he loved survival more than stubbornness. He nodded. "Let them in." Karen quickly understood. People in the New World were also a resource. Not in a cold sense. Not as raw material, but as building material. Some could carry stone. Others could sew. A third group could work with wood. A fourth could watch the children while the others were busy. A fifth knew nothing except how to survive. And that was also a skill. He began assigning the refugees to tasks. An old man who had once been a lumberjack immediately went to prepare logs. A middle-aged woman, a former weaver, helped make awnings and sacks for dry supplies. A youth with strong hands turned out to be a mason's apprentice, and Karen literally came to life. Stonework with such a person will go twice as fast. For the first time, he felt that this was like playing not alone but in co-op. Only the stakes here were lives. By evening, he already knew the names of almost half of them. And something else. Among the refugees was a former carpenter named Dorn. Not just a carpenter, but a man who knew how to make beams, doors, furniture, and, what was especially important, roofs. This was gold. Chiron caught him by the storehouse. "Do you know how to assemble trusses?" Dorn looked at him tiredly. "What?" "A roof frame with a slope so snow does not press down on it." "I do." "Excellent. Tomorrow I will show you the place. We need a new house. For whom?" "For you." Dorn was silent. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Chiron answered honestly. "Because if I want to build something big, I need people. And if I have only walls without people, it is just a fortress. I need a settlement." Dorn looked at him for a long time, then slowly nodded. "All right, builder. Show me." The first house was not built for beauty. For function. Chiron chose a place on a small rise near the stove and the future storehouse. First, they cleared the site of stones and roots. Then they leveled the ground. This took almost a day, but he did not rush them. A bad foundation later takes revenge. He explained every step. Here will be the stone base. Not high, but enough so the wood does not touch the damp soil. Here are the support posts, and here are the diagonal braces. They do not let the walls sway from the wind. The roof is gabled. The angle is steeper than seems convenient to you, because rain and snow must come off it, not lie on top. Dorn listened attentively. The carpenter was one of those people who love good logic. This was immediately visible from the way he nodded when he heard the right thought. They used stones from the northern slope for the foundation, oak logs for the posts, lighter pine for the rafters, clay with sand for sealing the gaps, dry moss as insulation between the logs. Chiron showed one more important thing. Do not make the floor level with the ground. Raise it at least half an elbow. Otherwise, dampness will go inside. "Where do you know all this from?" Dorn asked yet again. "From experience." "What kind?" "A very strange one." Dorn looked at him but did not press. That was a good quality. When the house was almost ready, Chiron for the first time felt the satisfaction that only a builder feels. There it was. Not in imagination, not in plans, but in reality. Frame, walls, roof, chimney. A place for the hearth, a small bench by the wall, a small niche for tools. It was not yet a house in the full sense, but it was no longer just a pile of wood. Horn came to look in the evening. He stopped at the entrance, stood there, then slowly said, "This looks like a house." Chiron smiled. "Exactly." The elder walked around it, touched the wall, looked inside. "It is better than our old ones, because the old ones were built however people managed." Horn was silent. "You want to build more?" "Yes." "How many?" Chiron looked at the already marked site nearby. "As many as we have strength for." After the house, it was the workshop's turn. This was a key object. Without it, everything else would depend on manual labor, which was slow, uneven, and easily broken. The workshop had to become the place where tools were created for all the other buildings. Chiron set aside a place next to the forge. Why next to it? Because the blacksmith needs access to wood and stone and the carpenter to metal. In games, this is called logistics. In life, common sense. He began with a workbench. There was nothing complicated. A thick board reinforced on massive legs with recesses for cutters and clamps. Then shelves for finished parts. Then a rack for measuring cords, squares, planes, chisels. Dorn was glowing. Finally, a proper place. "Yes," said Chiron. "Now we can work not on the ground, but on a surface. You say strange things, but they make sense. That is almost everything I know how to do." They began making things that would have been a luxury in an ordinary village. Sturdy door frames, brackets for fastening beams, wooden wedges, guides for sawing, simple measuring templates so that all parts would be identical. This was what made construction real. Not one beautiful building, but the ability to repeat the result. Chiron explained, "If we cannot make identical parts, we will always be building from scratch. But if there is a template, we can speed up." Dorn looked at him with respect. "You are not just building? I am building a system." The creatures came at night, not directly into the settlement. First to the northern slope, to the wood stores. The guard raised the alarm before anyone else. Chiron rushed out of the house in a leather cloak with a knife and a torch. His heart was beating fast, but his head was clear. He saw them from afar. 3. Gray, low, with long paws and sharp snouts. Not wolves. Something worse. Definitely fantasy creatures. Fast, predatory, adapted to the forest and darkness. Good. So the wall is not just for beauty. One creature was already trying to climb onto the storehouse along the logs. Chiron did not rush into a fight with them thoughtlessly. First, the torch. He threw it into the dry grass by the path where, in advance during the day, he had left a layer of resinous bark. The fire flared quickly, cutting off the retreat path. Then noise. The guards beat on boards, shouted, and knocked on empty barrels. The creatures twitched. One rushed toward the side where the passage was narrow and inconvenient. That was exactly where Chiron had ordered a heavy cart placed during the day. Now he sharply pulled the rope. The cart fell onto its side, blocking the passage. One creature got stuck. It was finished off with spears. The other 2 went back into the forest. Chiron stood with the torch and breathed heavily. Horn arrived later. He looked at the creature's corpse, at the people, at the fire by the path, at the cart that had blocked the passage. You prepared all of this in advance? Chiron nodded. Yes, how did you know they would come? I did not know. I simply decided that if they came, it would be inconvenient for them. Horn looked at him for a long time, then said quietly, Is this what real power is? Chiron did not answer immediately, then said, No, this is just good preparation. After the attack, Horn stopped arguing about almost everything. That did not mean he had become soft. He simply saw the result, and Chiron received permission for the most important project, a large storehouse with a system of protection against dampness and fire. The storehouse took a long time to build, because it was no longer a shed, but real infrastructure. Chiron planned it by sections. Dry grains, salted products, tools, wood, cloth, a separate compartment for seeds. The most important thing was the floor. He raised it on stone supports. He left an air gap between the ground and the boards, so dampness would not rise upward. Along the walls, ventilation gaps under the overhang, so air would circulate but rain would not get inside. It was a simple idea, but in a world where people were used to losses, simple ideas changed everything. When the first batch of grain was moved into the storehouse, Elder Horn came to check it himself. And this will not rot? It should not. And if the winter is wet, then the gaps will work. And if mice? Chiron had already been waiting for that question. We place metal plates along the lower edge of the shelves and traps in the corners. Horn narrowed his eyes. You thought everything through in advance. Yes. Why? Chiron looked at the storehouse. Because any good project does not break on the main idea. It breaks on the small things. The place began to grow. At first only refugees came, then those who heard about the settlement, then loners, craftsmen, shepherds, people who had lost their village, people who had nowhere to go, people who were looking for a place where they could work and not die within a month. Chiron did not refuse without a reason, but he also did not accept everyone indiscriminately. He understood, if they took in anyone, the settlement would drown in disorder. Structure was needed. Therefore, he introduced simple rules. A new person receives shelter and food for 3 days. In 3 days, he shows how he is useful. If he is useful, he stays and receives work. If not, he is given another chance at a simpler task. Horn doubted at first. You are turning the acceptance of people almost into a hiring system. Yes, why? Because people are not only trouble or mercy, they are also responsibility. If we simply take everyone in, we will not be able to support them. The elder thought for a long time, then slowly nodded. You speak like a person who has seen large settlements. Chiron smiled slightly. I have, but he did not specify where and when. Chiron began to understand that he was not building a village, and not just a fortified camp. He was building the core of a future kingdom. He already had a safe core of the settlement, a stove, the first house, a workshop, a storehouse, vegetable gardens, a reinforced wall, a system for accepting people, protection from small creatures, and most importantly, trust. Without trust, nothing grows. He sat in the evening by the fire with Dorn and Horn. What do you think we will have in a year? Asked Horn. Chiron looked at the fire. The question was interesting. If everything goes normally, another wall, proper barns, several workshops, a separate district for new people, permanent guards, possibly the simplest bathhouse, and a water channel if I find a suitable slope. Dorn chuckled. You talk about it as if you have already almost built it. Because I see the path. Horn shook his head. And what then? Chiron did not answer immediately, because what he said next was no longer about survival. Then we will stop being a settlement. And become what? Asked Dorn. Chiron looked at the dark line of the forest, a force that will have to be taken into account. The wind stirred the flame. Somewhere in the distance, someone was striking metal with a hammer. The settlement lived. They began expansion, not with walls, with meaning. Chiron understood that if they simply pushed the borders outward, nothing would change. The place needed to be given a new structure. He suggested dividing the settlement into zones: residential zone, production zone, storage zone, defensive zone, agricultural zone, guest zone for those who came temporarily. At first, Horn did not understand why this was needed. Chiron explained, if everything is mixed together, people waste time on unnecessary movement. Dirt, noise, losses. But if everything is divided, everyone knows where to go. You want to make the village like a mechanism? Yes, but a living one. Dorn liked that word. He caught on to it. A living mechanism. Well said. Karen also understood why this was important. Chaos hinders growth. And structure allows not just survival, but the accumulation of strength. There was a lot of work. Chiron personally took part in marking the future roads between the zones. He poured stone chips so that after rain, the dirt would not turn into a swamp. He explained where it was better to place drainage ditches, where to lay the water runoff, where to leave space for new houses. People began to notice that it had become easier to walk in the settlement. Less mud, fewer slippery paths, less wasted time. And that was already almost magic. By autumn, rumors about the settlement had already begun to spread. Not because it had become large, because it had become convenient. And a convenient place always attracts people. They said that it was safe there, that they gave work there, that there were stoves, warm houses, and supplies there, that refugees were not abandoned there, that there was a man there who knew how to build. Rumors were the best advertisement. They came on their own. One day, a merchant knocked at the gates. Not rich, but not poor either. With a cart, 2 assistants, and 10 sacks of tools. I heard you need iron. Karen looked at him with interest. Depends on the price. The merchant smirked. You bargain like a local. I am a local, Chiron answered. The merchant wanted to enter the settlement as if it were an ordinary village. But he saw the storehouse, the workshop, the guards, and understood that before him was not a village. It was already a center. Still small, but a center. He proposed an exchange: iron for grain, tools for wood, fabrics for the right to stand by their gates in winter. Chiron did not agree immediately. He arranged a meeting with Horn and Dorn, because trade is not just goods, it is influence. The first trading area was made quickly, right by the outer ring of the settlement, on a level site between the gate and the road. Chiron ordered awnings, tables, and simple markings for trading places to be set up. Nothing complicated, but already order. When traders came there for the first time, people from the settlement stood on the sides and watched as if they were seeing for the first time how the future was born from exchange. Horn did not hide his surprise. You thought of this in advance too? Of course. Why did you not say so earlier? Because first there had to be demand. This was an important moment. The settlement no longer simply consumed, it began to produce. Surplus grain, prepared wood, simple ceramics from its own stove, small metal parts from the forge, ropes, sacks, repaired tools. In exchange for this, they began to receive salt, metal, cloth, medicinal herbs, lamp oil, good knives, stronger nails. Chiron looked at all of this and understood that economy was also construction, only made of exchange. By winter, he began building the first tower. Not a watchtower in the full sense, an observation one. Small on the northeastern ledge where he had once stood for the first time. This place was ideal. Height, good view, stone. Less risk of fire. Dorn helped with the wooden platform above. Horn with the stonework. Chiron himself directed the project because there were too many important things here. The tower was built from a stone base, an oak frame inside, a staircase with narrow steps, an observation platform, a simple rain shelter, a signal place for a torch. This was no longer just a building, it was a symbol. If a settlement has a tower, it has sight. If it has sight, it is not blind. If it is not blind, it cannot be easily destroyed. In winter, the creatures came again, but not the same way as before. Now the settlement had an alarm system. Primitive, but working. Back in autumn, Chiron had ordered thin threads with hanging metal plates to be stretched between the trees. Not traps, but noise lines. If something large moves through the forest, the ringing can be heard immediately. At night, the tower gave the signal. Torch, bell, shouts. Chiron was already in place when it became clear there were not 3 creatures, but 9. They were not simply going for the storehouse, they were going for the gates. It was an attempt to test the fortifications. And here the main thing became clear. The settlement was no longer the same. People did not run in panic. The guards took positions. The blacksmith brought spare spears. Dorn and the carpenters closed the inner passages. The refugees who had once been simply rescued people were already dragging stones for the barricades themselves. From the tower, Chiron saw the entire formation and understood. It works. The creatures rushed toward the gates and ran into the double gate. Propped from the inside, the prepared heavy logs, the stones that could be dropped from the upper platform. They did not get through. 2 retreated, 1 was killed at the gates, the rest went back into the forest. When it was all over, a heavy silence stood in the settlement. Horn looked down at Chiron from above. If we had not had the tower? Yes, if not for that thread. Yes, if not for your barricades? Yes. Horn was silent, then said, "You are not just building a house." Chiron wiped blood from his hand, not his own, someone else's, which had accidentally gotten on him. I know, after the winter attack, people began to speak of the settlement differently. Not as a place where one could wait things out, but as a place where one could stay. It was a very important difference. Because the first option is temporary, the second is already almost fate. Chiron felt that he had taken the first real step towards something greater. Still small, still fragile, but already alive. He sat by the fire with Horn. "What will you call this place?" asked the elder. Chiron looked at the walls, at the tower, at the workshop, at the smoke from the stove, at the people who were not sleeping and were not as afraid of the darkness as before. Then he quietly answered, "Nothing for now." Why? Because a true name must be earned. Horn thought for a moment. "And when will it appear?" Chiron looked into the fire. "When there are enough people here for this place to live on its own." The elder nodded. "Then we are already close." Chiron smiled. Yes, very close. In spring, he began what he considered most important. Not a wall, not a house, not a tower, a craft school. Because if everything depended only on him, the settlement would not be able to grow. Knowledge had to be passed on. He gathered children and teenagers and then adults who wanted to learn. He showed how to choose good wood, measure angles, dry boards, mix clay, lay a foundation, make simple joints without unnecessary loss of material, build so that things could be repaired, not broken, and rebuilt. People listened and gradually began to repeat. Dorn began teaching apprentices carpentry. Horn taught the old warriors and the guards. The women who had already mastered the storage of supplies taught the younger ones how to make sacks, bandages, dried provisions, candles. The settlement stopped being a collection of random efforts. It was becoming a school of survival. And it was in this that Chiron saw his true future. Not simply to survive himself, to build a place where others could survive too. A year passed. In the place of the small settlement now stood 2 rings of fortifications, an observation tower, a storehouse, a workshop, a forge, a stovehouse, 8 proper residential buildings, a common dining hall, a trading area, and a craft school. The settlement still did not have a great army. It did not have a castle. It did not have a king. But it already had a system. Refugees became residents. Residents became workers. Workers became builders. And the builders had already begun thinking about borders, the road, and neighboring lands. Chiron stood on the tower, looked at the forest, and saw not a threat, but space. Space for growth, space for a wall, for a road, for a market, for a new center, for a kingdom that did not yet know its name, but was already beginning to be born. And he, a man who had once lived in a world of survival games, understood for the first time. Games do not teach you to build a house. They teach you to understand that any house is only the beginning. Spring came with mud. That was the first thing Chiron understood when the snow finally left the lowlands. The roads around the settlement turned soggy, carts got stuck, boots sank into clay, and under the tower he had built all of last year, murky water gathered. But spring was exactly the time when weak spots became most visible. Chiron stood at the edge of the future central square and watched two teenagers carry boards to the new storehouse. Behind them walked a woman with a basket of seeds. Behind her, Dorn with a roll of rope over his shoulder. Farther still, Horn, cursing at a young guard who had once again put his spear in the wrong place. The settlement lived. It no longer survived. It lived. And yet it had no name. This irritated Charon more and more. Without a name, the place seemed not to fully exist. In games, in his former life, the first thing you did was come up with a name for a base, fortress, settlement, even if it was just 3 tents and a campfire. A name is the first step toward memory, toward identity, toward the future. He gathered Horn, Dorn, and 5 more senior residents for a meeting in the large hall. "We need a name," he said without introduction. Horn frowned. "A name for what?" "For this place." The old man scratched his chin. "It already has one. The village by the northern forest. That is not a name. It is a description." Dorn smirked. "Well, now even the village needs a title." Chiron did not smile. "If we want to grow, people must know us. By name. Traders, travelers, neighbors. When there is a caravan route, when there are letters, when people from the south or east come to us, they will need something to pronounce." Horn slowly nodded. "All right, suggest one." Charon did not answer immediately. He had been thinking about this for more than one day. The name had to be simple, strong, without unnecessary pomp. He knew such things from game experience. If a name is too grand, people laugh. If it is too soft, they forget it. "Stoneyard," he said. Dorn raised an eyebrow. "Too direct?" "Yard?" Horn snorted. "That already sounds like a little town." "Exactly. We will not be a village forever." The elders exchanged glances. The woman with the seeds quietly said, "I like it. It sounds firm." Horn thought a little more, then nodded. "Let it be so." And at that moment, Charon felt for the first time that the place he was building had become a little more real, as if the name were another stone in the foundation. A name is not just a word. A name requires a road. Because a place without a road is a strong island, but not a center. Chiron understood this from the very beginning. And therefore, as soon as the ground dried, he began building a path to the main road. Not a full stone road, it was too early for that, but a reliable forest clearing with a gravel base, drainage ditches, and reinforced sections in swampy places. The work was hard. First, the lumberjacks felled trees along the line of the future road. Then the carpenters removed roots. Then the masons and workers filled the soft soil with crushed stone. The weakest sections were covered with decking, made of thick boards so carts would not sink. Chiron personally watched the slope. "The road must not hold water," he explained to Dorn. "If water stands, everything will rot. If water leaves, the road lives longer." "You are talking again as if you are building not a path, but an organism." "That is exactly what it is." Dorn laughed, but without mockery. He had long since understood that Charon had a strange head in which things were connected differently than for everyone else. And that made him useful. Very useful. A week later, the first travelers began coming to them. Not random ones, purposeful ones. First, one merchant with 2 assistants. Then a pair of hunters. Then a small family looking for a place to wait out the summer. Then a former craftsman from a southern city whose workshop had burned down. They were going to Stoneyard because they had already heard of it. And here Charon understood. A road is not only a path outward, it is a path inward. The forge had long since been working as something more than temporary. But now Charon decided to make it a real production center. He wanted a separate forge hall. Not just a pit with a hearth, but a building where one could forge in any weather, store metal, straighten tools, make brackets, nails, hinges, knives, locks, and parts for future buildings. Horn was at first surprised by the scale. "You want too much." "No, I want exactly as much as is needed so we do not have to redo it later." The blacksmith whom Chiron had brought from the refugees, a former master named Roth, turned out to have character. A difficult man, gloomy, but very precise. He looked at the plan and said, "If we build it the way you want, we need a stone foundation, good ventilation, and a coal reserve of no less than 3 months." "Exactly, and a place for water nearby, already chosen." Roth nodded. "Have you ever made a forge?" Charon smirked. "No, but I know how it should work." For the first time, Roth looked at him with respect. "Then maybe it will work out." The construction of the forge hall took almost a month. First, they made the stone base and set high support beams so the roof would not sag from the heat. Then the exhaust pipe with side openings for draft. Then coal boxes. Then a wall for cooling tools. Karen insisted on a separate place for tempering. If you put it right in the common hall, there will be confusion, he said. And here everything is in order. Roth only snorted. When the first batch of iron brackets came out of the new forge, Stoneyard for the first time began to feel like not just a settlement, but a production center. Summer did not bring peace. On the contrary, the flow of refugees became stronger. People came from the south after a beast raid. From the east, a family of farmers driven out by drought. From the north, 2 carpenters and their apprentices, whose workshop had been burned. And Karen perceived all of this not as a disaster, but as a resource and a problem at the same time. This was his main difference from most local elders. He did not see only hungry mouths in people. He saw potential hands, but only if they were properly included in the system. He introduced a second level of settlement organization. Now the residents were divided into groups: builders, gatherers, plowmen, guards, craftsmen, service workers, newcomers on a trial period. Each group had a senior, each senior had a report, each task had a deadline. Horn once looked at this and said, "You run the village like an army." "No," Chiron answered, "like a base that must survive." The difference? For an army, the main thing is to win. For a base, not to fall apart. Horn thought for a moment, then nodded briefly. Well said. By autumn, it became clear the inner ring was no longer enough. The number of people had grown. There were more houses. The storehouses were almost full. The trading area had come alive. The new road to the main route was already bringing benefit, and that meant only one thing. They needed to build a second line of defense. But Karen did not want just another wall. He wanted a proper wall. In games, he had seen many times how beginners built the outer defensive line too close to the inner houses, and then complained that the enemy had approached too easily. Here, he intended to do it differently. The second line had to expand the perimeter, leave space between the walls for maneuvering, have towers at key points, include gates with double barriers, have a backup passage for evacuation, and, most importantly, be connected to the terrain. He chose a section on the western side where the ground rose slightly. This gave an advantage for visibility and reduced the risk of tunneling. Dorn looked at the plan and whistled. "You want not a wall, but a fortress." "Yes, and if there is not enough money?" Karen smirked. "There will be. Where does such confidence come from? Because now we have a road, a storehouse, production, and trade. Money is the consequence of structure." It was one of those phrases that others later began repeating. First with surprise, then as if it had always been that way. But not everything was smooth. The more Stoneyard grew, the more people appeared who wanted to live the old way. They believed that walls, accounting, duties, and division of labor were too much. That a village should be simple. That Karen interfered too much. That the old people knew better. At first, these were whispers, then arguments at the council. One evening, one of the senior plowmen, a man named Gret, stood before everyone and said, "We are building too much. People are already tired. Why do we need another tower and a second wall?" "We are not a fortress." Chiron was not offended. It was expected. "Because there is not emptiness around us," he answered. "Because if we stop, problems will overtake us." "What other problems?" "The forests are full of creatures. The road attracts outsiders. Winter will come. More people means more food is needed. More food means more supplies. More supplies means more protection." Gret crossed his arms. "You think too far ahead, and you think too close." The silence became heavy. Horn wanted to intervene, but Karen raised his hand. "If we build only for today, we lose tomorrow." "And if we build too much," Gret objected, "then people will burn out." Chiron nodded. That was fair. He was not going to turn the settlement into hard labor. "That is why we will have shifts. Rest, seasonal work, and the craft school, so that not only the old carry everything on themselves." Gret remained silent with a frown. Then Karen did what he often did in games, but what people rarely do in life. He offered a compromise, but a useful one. "We are not building the entire wall at once. First the western section, then the northern, then the gates and towers, in parts, and people will not burn out." Horn nodded first, then Dorn, then several others. Gret remained dissatisfied, but the argument was won. The western hill was the most important place. From there, the road, part of the forest, and the approach to the main route were visible. If the enemy came from this side, the tower had to see him before anyone else. Karen wanted not just an observation point. He wanted an alarm system, logistics, and a command hub. The tower had to have A stone base, a wooden upper floor, a store of arrows, a place for torches and signal lights, an internal staircase, not an external one, a small restroom for the guard shift. He personally selected the stone for the base. Not this one. Too loose. This one has a crack. We bind 2 blocks with a metal bracket. Here we need a slope so rain does not stand at the foot. Roth, the blacksmith, made the brackets. Dorn made the floors. Horn assigned the guards. And this was when people appeared in Stoneyard for the first time, who were not just building, but building defense with an understanding of why it was needed. When the tower rose above the hill, the residents gathered at its foot and looked upward for a long time. It was not the biggest, but it meant too much, because a tower is eyes. In autumn, a large caravan came. Not random traders, a real caravan? 7 carts, guards, 2 managers, wagoners, a connection with the outside market. This was the moment of truth. If trade did not work, everything would remain just a large settlement. If it worked, Stoneyard would become a hub. Karen met them at the gates himself. The caravan's leader, a lean man in a good quality cloak, looked over the settlement and narrowed his eyes. "So you are Stoneyard?" "Yes, and where is your master?" Chiron was not offended. "Before you," the man blinked. "You are too young. Did you come to trade or discuss my age?" The merchant snorted. He liked that more than he wanted to show. The caravan brought metal, salt, oil, 2 sacks of good seeds, and a rare commodity, lime. Karen almost immediately understood that lime was a huge stroke of luck. Lime was needed for mortar, for stronger masonry, for disinfection, for plaster, for some types of water treatment. This was already progress, real progress. He did not bargain only on the level of how much it cost. He proposed an exchange as a system. We can provide grain, wood, wagon repairs, lodging, a safe storehouse, and escort to the next point, and a permanent market on Mondays and Fridays. The caravan leader looked at him more carefully. "You have a market? It will be even better. And you really can provide security?" Karen turned toward the tower. "For now, yes." The merchant thought for a long time, then nodded. "Then we will return." And that phrase itself became more important than gold for Stoneyard, because a returning caravan was already a connection. Lime changed everything. Karen understood this immediately. Because lime was not just white powder, it was the basis of good mortar. It was strong walls, better fastening of stone, plaster that kept dampness out, even sanitation. He immediately ordered, set aside part for the masonry of the second wall, part for the mortar for the tower, part for treating the well, part for disinfection in the places where refugees slept. Horn looked at him and shook his head. "You are rejoicing like a child. This is an important resource, I am not arguing. It is just that you look as if you found a treasure. That is exactly what it is." Roth, the blacksmith, also approved. With good mortar, even stone lays differently. Not just a wall, but a wall that holds. That was exactly what Karen wanted to hear. By the end of autumn, Stoneyard was no longer a starting base. It was a real settlement. It had roads, a storage system, a market, towers, a forge, workshops, a school, a second line of wall under construction, trade relations, refugees who had become citizens, guards, and its own character. People began to say not "I am going to the village," but "I am going to Stoneyard." That was the moment when Chiron understood. The process had left the stage of survival and entered the stage of development. He sat in the evening on the unfinished wall, looking at the lights of the houses. Horn climbed up to him later. "Are you satisfied?" Karen thought. "Not entirely." "Why?" "Because this is only the beginning." Horn smirked. "You never stop." "And why should I?" "Maybe in order to live." Chiron looked at him. "I am living. It is just that in my understanding, life is movement forward." The old man could not find an answer. Then he quietly said, "You changed this place." Chiron looked at the lights. "No, what?" "I did not change it alone. I simply gave form to what people already wanted to build." Horn was silent for a long time, then nodded. It was the right answer. 5 years ago, Stoneyard had been a forest clearing with several tents and a campfire. Now it was a center known to caravanners, traders, and refugees. Still small, still vulnerable, but already strong. And most importantly, it had begun to grow on its own. Karen stood in the tower and looked at the horizon. He no longer saw only survival. He saw routes, expansion, an additional wall, underground drainage, new houses, workshops, a mill on the river, a place for a future council hall, a tower in the east, a new market, a small harbor if a river was ever found, a road to neighboring lands, alliances. He did not see a village. He saw the embryo of a kingdom, and that was exactly why he had once loved survival games. Only now the game was real, and the world was too alive to allow building without consequences. Karin learned about Lord Gairn not immediately, but through the consequences. First 2 trade caravans disappeared. Then small wagon trains from the eastern road stopped entering Stone Yard. Then one of the patrols returned with damaged carts and silently handed Karin a broken arrow with a foreign notch. It was a bad sign. Not because arrows were rare, but because the notch was lordly. Karin sat in the council hall, already a real one, not temporary, with a long table, a wall map, and tablets with reports, and looked at this fragment. Roth, the blacksmith, stood nearby and gloomily scratched his chin. "These are not bandits," he said. "Theirs have worse arrows." "Yes?" Horn, sitting at the head of the table, frowned. "Then who?" Karin raised his eyes. "Someone who considers the eastern road his own." Silence. That was enough. Gairn owned the lands beyond the river in the east. A small but not weak lord. An old family, strong walls, several villages, a forest, part of the road, and, most unpleasantly, the right to collect tolls at the old ford. Karin already knew this from the map. The problem was not the lord himself. The problem was that Stoneyard was growing too fast and had begun to cross the interests of the old land. "He is afraid of losing income," said Dorn. "Or influence," added Horn. "Or he wants to test us," finished Karin, and all 3 looked at the map. A threat, if not stopped, could become bigger than one broken arrow. Karin did not want war, for now. He was not naive. In games he had learned too well, sometimes a fight is inevitable. But starting at first is foolish if there is still a chance to turn a conflict into a system. Therefore he chose negotiations, not in the form of an official message with seals. Too early and too meaningful. He sent Gairn a neutral invitation to a meeting at the ford, without soldiers, with 3 companions from each side, as equals. Horn looked at the letter and snorted. "Do you really think he will come?" "If he does not come, that is also an answer." "And what will he say?" Karin shrugged. "We will see how confident he is in his rights." Dorn, standing by the window, smirked. "And if he sends people with swords? Then we will understand that his interest is not conversation, but pressure." "And what then?" Karin looked at the wall. "Then we will start thinking about the second wall faster." The ford was old, so old that the stones under the water had already fallen out in places, and the current had begun washing away the bottom. But it was an important crossing between the lands, and that was exactly why Gairn kept a toll there. Karin arrived early with 2 guards and Horn. Gairn arrived later. He turned out to be exactly as rumors described him. Tall, narrow-shouldered, with gray mustaches and the face of a man used to not asking. Behind him rode 5 men, enough to show strength, but not so many as to cause an obvious threat. The lord stopped at the ford and did not dismount immediately. "So you are the builder?" he asked from the height of the saddle. Karin looked at him calmly. "And you are the lord who shoots at traitors without talking?" Gairn smirked. "So your tongue is sharp. It simply does not like stupidity." A shadow of a smile flashed across the lord's face and disappeared. "You are too young to build a fortress on my side of the road, and you are too old to think the forest is motionless." This was already almost a direct challenge. Horn tensed, but Gairn unexpectedly dismounted. "Speak, what do you want?" Karin nodded toward the stones of the ford. "For you to understand, Stoneyard is not taking your roads away. It is making them safer. Traders go where there is less risk. If your road is falling apart and we have fortifications, a storehouse, and a market, they will choose us. So you want to take my income peacefully. I want you to receive it not through a toll on a broken ford, but through participation in a new trade line." Gairn narrowed his eyes. "Continue." Karin took out a roll with a plan. "We want to reinforce the road to the ford, place wooden decking on the weak sections, and make a joint post for protection and tolls. You receive a percentage from passage, but no longer as a monopolist, as a partner. Stoneyard takes part of the logistics. Traders receive security. You receive stable income." Horn silently watched. Gairn looked at the plan for a long time, then slowly asked, "And if I refuse?" Karin answered honestly, "Then the traders will go to us anyway. Not immediately, but they will go, and in a year you will lose more." The Lord was silent, then suddenly laughed shortly in a low voice. "You speak like a man who is not afraid to lose his head. I simply know that there are things more dangerous than threats. For example, a stupid war." Garen fell silent, and that was no longer a refusal. Negotiations with Garen took 3 meetings. It was more than Karen expected, but he did not complain. Trade is also construction, only not from stone, but from interests. Garen turned out not to be a fool. At first, he tried to pressure him with age, law, old borders, young upstart. Karen did not argue, he simply showed numbers. How many traders came to Stone Yard in a season? How many of them returned? How much grain was transported? How long the road through the bad section took? How many losses there were because of mud, bandits, and broken carts? Then he showed something else. If the ford is reinforced and a joint post is made, income from transit will increase, caravans will go more often, tolls can be reduced, but the total volume will compensate for the loss. People will stop bypassing the route, and Stoneyard will become not a competitor, but a center of exchange. Garen slowly changed his facial expression. A smart lord always suspects first, then calculates, then yields. "Did you calculate all this yourself?" he asked at the 3rd meeting. "Yes, where did you get such ideas?" Karen did not start talking about games. He simply answered, "I had a habit of building from scratch." Garen thought for a moment. "All right, I will give you a chance." It was almost an alliance? Almost. But in Karen's world, that already meant a great deal. The joint trade project began with a road. Always with a road. Karen insisted that they first reinforce not the ford, but the approaches to it. Because if you make a beautiful crossing but leave mud before it, the carts will still drown on the way. He organized, cutting down dangerous trees along the road, drainage ditches, gravel filling, wooden decking in swampy places. Guard points every half hour of travel, a place for caravans to spend the night. Horn laughed. "You are building the road like a great artery. That is exactly what it is. And what then? Then the road begins to feed us." Dorn, who now more and more often worked not only as a carpenter, but also as a construction manager, said, "If this works, Stoneyard will become more than just a fortress. That is exactly what I want." There was a sea of work, but after only a month, caravans really did begin to travel more often. First cautiously, then more boldly, then already habitually. With the growth of trade, danger also grew. The richer Stoneyard became, the more strongly it became a target. Karen saw this immediately. He ordered the first real fortress tower to be built at the northern corner of the wall. Not an observation tower, a combat one. It had to be higher, thicker, and already designed for defense. He personally insisted on narrow loopholes, an internal staircase, a stone base 3 human arms thick, a supply of arrows, a small storeroom inside, an upper platform for boiling water and stones, a cover over the entrance so it could not be easily set on fire. Horn at first wanted to make the tower simpler. That is an unnecessary expense. "No," Karen answered. "This is the difference between standing and falling." Dorn supported him. Roth too. Garen, when he heard about the project, only snorted. "Looks like you really are not joking about the fortress. I never joke about walls." The raid happened earlier than everyone expected. Not a war, not a siege, a night strike. 36 people with torches tried to break through to the storehouses and set the new buildings on fire. They were not ordinary robbers, too coordinated, too confident. Chiron heard the alarm from his room and was already on the wall a minute later. The signal passed through the towers, the guards moved into positions. Roth drove the blacksmiths with long spears into the inner yard. Horn led the left wing. Karen quickly understood. This was not a mass assault. It was an attempt to find a weak spot and create chaos. But there was no chaos, because the settlement was already a system. The attackers ran into lighting, barricades, organized defense, and blocked passages. Karen himself gave the signal from the tower with a torch, then a second one. And as soon as the raiders rushed toward the storehouses, arrows struck them from above. 3 fell at once. The rest retreated, but no longer in an organized way. Roth, restraining his rage, ran out onto the platform and shouted, "They burned marks on the gates!" Chiron immediately understood. These were not just bandits. This was a message. In the morning, Chiron himself went to look at the place where the attackers had approached the wall. He was not looking for blood. Tracks, always tracks. On the soft ground by the western rise, he saw boot prints, traces of shod horses, and most importantly, a sign. 3 short notches on the bark of the nearest tree, not by chance. Almost exactly the same as he had seen earlier on the foreign arrow. "So they have a sign," he muttered. Horn, standing nearby, frowned. "Whose?" "I do not know yet." But Karen already felt that this was not just robbery. It was an organized force. Someone was testing Stone Yard, and they were doing it not from the outside, but through a network they did not yet know about. It was almost funny. Chiron found the key to the mystery not in interrogation, not in battle, not in scouting. In the ledger. He sat at night in his workroom reviewing deliveries, records of goods, passages, firewood, coal, oil, metal, and suddenly noticed one strange thing. 3 weeks before the raid, too much salt from one and the same merchant had passed through Stone Yard. That in itself was not a problem. But the salt came through an intermediary who was connected to Garen's caravan. Chiron set the sheets aside, then checked again, and understood. Through trade routes, someone was collecting information about the guard schedule, the number of people, the location of the storehouses, the time of shifts. Not all at once. Bit by bit, there it is. He did not tell even Horn about this immediately. First he checked, then again. Because in his world, a bad hypothesis is a waste of lives. Chiron rode to Garen personally, without a show of force, only with 2 companions and a bundle of papers. The Lord received him in the stone house by the ford, already almost friendly. "The raiders?" he asked when he saw Karen's face. "Not exactly bandits." Garen frowned. "What do you mean, not exactly?" Chiron placed the papers before him. "There are too many traces of your people in our supplies." The Lord's face became cold. "Are you accusing me?" "No, I am saying that through your road someone was collecting information. Perhaps not you personally, but your collectors and intermediaries worked with outsiders." Garen was silent. "Who?" he finally asked. Karen looked straight at him. "That is exactly what I came to find out." The Lord sat motionless for a long time, then quietly said, "If this is true, I will tear out their tongue myself." And Karen understood. Garen was not the enemy, at least not the enemy they were looking for, and that was already useful. Together with Garen, they set a trap, not on the level of everyone knowing, quietly. Chiron proposed a fictitious delivery through the ford, supposedly with valuable cargo that would go through Stone Yard at night, under reinforced guard. In essence, a false caravan, in which there was nothing valuable except the bait itself. Garen sent out his people. Chiron deployed his own. Horn was against it at first. "This is too risky. But we will learn exactly who is leaking information. And if they attack for real, then there will be more of us than they expect." Garen, after learning the plan, snorted, "Your head is like a fortress, sometimes like a trap." The trap worked. The raiders came. There were fewer of them than last time, but they moved confidently, which meant they believed they knew the schedule. Chiron waited for them in the tower. When the first 2 appeared by the false cart, he gave the signal. Garen's people intercepted the rear. Stone Yard closed the gates. Archers struck from above. One of the raiders was taken alive. That was the most important thing. The prisoner was brought at night. He was not a mercenary and not a bandit in the usual sense. A sturdy man with a torn scar on his neck in someone else's clothes, but with the hands of a man who knew not only the sword, but also letters. Horn gave him water. Chiron only looked. "Who hired you?" The prisoner was silent. Chiron did not hurry, he waited. And in the end the man said, "We were not hired, we were pushed." "By whom?" "The man by the trade lists. One of yours." Silence. Horn swore. Chiron closed his eyes for a second. So there is a traitor inside. He already suspected who it might be. But first, check. The prisoner said one more thing. They did not want to kill us. They wanted you to get scared and close yourselves off. So the caravans would go somewhere else. Karen raised his head. "Who?" But the prisoner only shook his head. "I do not know the name, only the mark." He showed the sign, the same 3 notches. This was worse than an external attack, because betrayal from within breaks trust. Karen gathered a narrow circle. Horn, Dorn, Roth, and 2 more people he truly trusted. They went through the lists, the signatories, the people at the storehouse, those who had access to the caravan schedules, and the name was found. Judging by the handwriting, the forgeries, and the routes, it was the accounting assistant, a quiet man named Belt. He had worked there for almost a year, never argued, always on time, and that was exactly what made him convenient. Chiron felt anger, not rage, cold, heavy anger. Where is he? Gone, said Dorn. He did not come this morning. Then he fled for a reason. Horn gloomily added, most likely he was warned. Chiron already understood everything. Belt was not the main figure, he was a channel. And that meant someone higher stood behind him. And this someone had realized that Stoneyard had begun looking too closely. Chiron did not arrange executions, not yet. But he arranged a trial, a public one, in the square. Before the residents, refugees, guards, and traders. This was important. Because if people see that betrayal does not remain in the shadows, trust does not collapse. He climbed onto the platform and said simply, they tried to break us. Not only from the outside, from the inside too. We know this. Silence. One of our people worked for those who wanted to frighten us and divert trade away. He fled. But we found traces, and we will keep searching. People listened silently. Karen continued, but I want you to understand something else. We will not become weaker because of this. On the contrary, we will build a system in which it will be harder to do this again. Horn stood beside him and for the first time in all that time, looked not just like an elder, but like a commander. Karen announced a new rule. All trade records are duplicated, caravan schedules are stored in 2 places, access to the storehouses is now divided. Anyone doing accounting work undergoes a check, and every major deal is recorded before witnesses. This was not just increased control, it was a transition towards statehood. After the trial, Stoneyard stopped being merely a convenient place. It became a structure. For the first time, people began to speak of it as a force, because now it had a market, a trade road, an alliance with Gairn, defenses, an internal court, accounting checks, the reputation of a reliable place, and the ability not to break under the first blow. Chiron stood on the tower and looked at the western ford. Caravans were moving there. Gairn's people were there. There was the road that now brought in more than it took away. Horn came up beside him. Did you achieve what you wanted? Chiron thought. No. Why? Because I did not want merely to survive. I wanted this place to become a point where decisions are made, not only endured. Horn slowly nodded. And it has. Not yet. What else is needed? Karen looked at the horizon. More land, more people, more walls. And most importantly, more order. Horn smirked. You definitely will not stop. No. Good. Stoneyard survived its first external test, survived internal betrayal, survived an attempt at intimidation, and came out of it not weaker but stronger. The alliance with Gairn turned it from a settlement into a regional hub. The road became income, the storehouse became strength, the tower became eyes, the people became a system. And Karen became a man who was no longer simply building a base. He was building a state. And somewhere far away beyond forests, rivers, and old roads, others were already beginning to notice. A new place had appeared on the border, one that was growing too fast. And that meant that soon, not only traders would come, soon those who test fortresses for real would come. He arrived in the rain. That in itself was already unpleasant. By that time, Stoneyard had managed to change the terrain around itself so much that any bad weather turned into a separate problem. Roads became muddy, footbridges grew slippery, caravans were delayed. But right now, when gray, cold fog hung over the forest, an unfamiliar rider in a black cloak rode up to the gates. Behind him were 2 servants and 1 armed guard. Horn stood at the gates, Roth beside him, and 3 more guards, no longer beginners, but people who had gone through Stoneyard's first real problems with it. Name? Asked Horn. Lord Cern, answered the rider. Chiron, hearing the name, raised his head from the papers. Cern, one of the major lords of the western land. Not Gairn's neighbor, but far more dangerous. Holdings to the southwest, a fortress on high ground, an old family line, his own retinue, and, most importantly, the reputation of a man who liked to come where something had already grown. Karen stepped out onto the porch of the main house. Lord Cern removed his glove, looked down at him, and smiled barely noticeably. So you are the one who builds too fast? Chiron did not respond to the insult. And you are the one who arrived without an invitation? Cern laughed shortly but without amusement. I was told you had a sharp tongue. I was told you had a sharp interest in other people's lands. Cern stopped smiling. This was already closer to a conversation. It turned out Cern had more than one reason. He had not come to threaten directly. That would have been too crude even for him. He had come as an interested observer to look at Stoneyard, assess the roads, ask about trade, hint at future agreements. In other words, to check how deeply this place had rooted itself into the land. Karen understood this immediately. They talked in the large hall where there now hung not one but 3 maps. An internal map of the settlement, a map of roads and lands, and a map of defensive zones. Sayern studied them for a long time before speaking. You no longer have a village here, yes, and not quite a fortress. Not yet, but a very convenient hub. Chiron looked at him calmly. Did you come to pay a compliment? No. Sayern leaned back. I came to understand who you are. I am a builder. Do not be modest. A builder does not create in 2 years a place that all the lords of the surrounding lands are already talking about. Karen was silent. Sayern leaned forward. You need a patron. Silence. There it is. Why? Asked Karen. Because there is already too much interest around you. Garen helps you, but he will not hold everything if real powers come. And they will come. And you are offering yourself? I am offering protection. In exchange for a share of the transit, the right to keep my trading post by your northern road, and a place in negotiations when you make new agreements. Chiron looked at him attentively. He does not simply want to take a percentage. He wants to embed himself. This was worse and better at the same time, because such a person is not always an enemy, but he always changes the system. And if I refuse? Asked Karen. Sayern did not smile. Then I will still be interested, just in another form. This was a soft, very elegant way of saying, I am either an ally or a problem. Chiron gathered the council immediately. Horn, Dorn, Roth. Garen, who was also summoned urgently, because this already concerned not only Stoneyard, and 2 more senior trade representatives. Sayern waited in the guest hall, drank tea, and pretended not to hear how they discussed him behind the wall. Horn looked grim. He wants influence. Yes, Chiron answered. And what will he give? Legalization of our markets in the south. Protection from some minor lords. Possibly metal. Goods. But he will also take a share, access, the right to place his people. Garen snorted. A smart lord always comes for what has already grown. Exactly, said Karen. Dorn asked, and if he is not an ally but a trap? Then he plays the long game too well. Roth struck the table heavily with his palm. We cannot let a foreign hand inside just because it promises help. Chiron nodded. Agreed. But we cannot ignore him either. He is already here. If we simply drive him out, it will create an even more dangerous situation. Horn was silent for a long time, then said, What do you suggest? Chiron turned the map and pointed at the northern sector. Offer him exactly enough so that he cannot say he was humiliated, but cannot anchor himself too deeply. 1 trading place, a limited warehouse, a temporary agreement, and no retinue inside the walls. Garen narrowed his eyes. Will he agree? If he wants to enter the system, yes. If he wants to break it, no. And then? Karen looked at the wall. Then we will know. Before the meeting with Sayern, Karen thought for a long time, and it was then that he almost made a mistake. He wanted to offer the Lord terms that were too favorable. Why? Because he was used to thinking like a builder who wanted to obtain materials, access, and people faster. But in politics, an overly generous concession is not a bridge. It is a door. And later, that door opens inward. Horn stopped him right at the paper. You are giving too much. I want him to enter the system, and I want him not to walk into your house with his feet. Chiron froze, then slowly set the pen aside. What would you suggest? Horn thought. Give him a sufficient percentage, but no more. Give him a warehouse outside the walls. Give him a trading day, but not the right of permanent presence. Let him feel benefit, but not power. Chiron was silent for a long time, then slowly smiled. Good. It was an important moment, because he once again saw, building is not only adding. Sometimes you must not add too much in time. Sayern turned out to be experienced. Very. From the first minutes, he understood that Karen was not someone easily spun around on emotions. So he tried to press differently, with respect, hints, pauses, offers of mutual security. Chiron answered calmly and dryly. 1 trading post outside the outer wall. Too little, noted Sayern. Enough for a start. My people must have access to the market. Access to the market? Yes, to the storehouses, only on schedule and under supervision. Sayern thoughtfully stroked the edge of the cup with his finger. You are cautious. I live in a world where caution is cheaper than war. A strong position for such a young man. Karen did not smile. Yours is no weaker. Saren looked straight at him. I want you to understand. I did not come to break you. I came in time. It was an unpleasant phrase because it was true. This is exactly how the absorption of small forces often begins. Not with a blow, but with an offer after which it is already hard to say no. Karen held the pause. You will receive a trading post, but only outside the wall, along the northern road, for a limited term. If cooperation goes normally, we will extend it. Saren was silent, then nodded. It will do, but Karen already saw that this was not the end. Only the first step. The trading post was built quickly. Saren sent his own masters, but Karen controlled everything. He did not allow them to use their own wall scheme. He did not allow them to run pipes into the common water hub. He did not allow weapons to be stored inside the settlement. This caused tension. That was exactly what he wanted. Because if something went wrong, it was better for it to happen during construction, not when the trading post had already grown into the system. Saren's people were polite, too polite. One of them, a thin scribe with attentive eyes, lingered too long by the storehouse books. Rain noticed it first. He is counting something. Let him count, Chiron answered. Only let him know that he is being counted too. Rain smirked. Do you like this? No, but I am used to it. Saren could not help but try. A week after the trading post was launched, he hinted that it would be convenient to place a permanent representative inside Stone Yard to speed up decisions. Karen immediately understood where the conversation was going. No, it is just a coordinator. No, why are you so firmly against it? Karen looked at him. Because anything temporary in politics sooner or later becomes permanent. Saren smirked. You already sound like a ruler. I am the ruler of Stone Yard. Formally, perhaps. This phrase was almost a threat, but Karen answered without emotion. Formally, these are my walls, my people, my market, and my agreements. So yes. Silence. Saren understood that he had overstepped, and retreated half a step. You know how to defend a border. I build borders. 2 weeks after the opening of the trading post, an alarm came. Not large, but enough to raise the tower. People were spotted in the forest on the northern path. Rain quickly led out scouts. Chiron went to the wall. Garen arrived that same evening, as if he had already understood that the situation was more important than an ordinary raid. Saren sent his guards, and it was a moment when everyone looked at each other and tried to understand who actually needed whom. The scouts returned by dawn. Not bandits, said Rain, and not Saren's people. Then who? Asked Horn. Rain was silent for a moment. The tracks lead back to the eastern road, and to the Old Forest carriers. Karen frowned. Old Forest carriers? Those who work outside official roads, smugglers, buyers, people without flags. Hearing this, Saren visibly tensed for the first time. Is someone working against me? Karen looked at him, quite possibly, or against all of us. Now they were going truly deep. Karen began to understand that Stone Yard was no longer a small problem for one lord. It had become a hub that attracted those who earned money from chaos. The forest carriers were exactly that kind. They did not fully obey any house. They moved goods, weapons, information, and sometimes people. If they were not touched, they knew how to live in the shadows. If touched, they turned into a network that could strike in several places at once. This was worse than an army. Because an army has a banner, the carriers do not. Karen gathered all key people. We need to block the forest routes. Horn frowned. That will take long, yes, and be expensive. Yes, and if they leave through other paths, then we will make new posts. And another line of control. Saren remained silent during this, but Chiron felt his attention. Interesting, he is not interfering, for now. Garen, who had come to the council as a neighbor and ally, said, if you start pressuring the smugglers, they will not disappear. They will simply become more cautious. I know. And what then? Karen answered. Then we need not a hunt, we need a network. He began building what he had not yet had in full form before. A network, not a military one, not only a trade one, an information one. Rain became responsible for external observation. The trade scribes collected data about roads, cargo, and people. Garen gave 2 reliable men to the Ford. Dorn organized markings for storehouses and caravans. Horn handled patrols along the night perimeter. And Karen introduced a simple rule. Any suspicious cargo, any unusual coincidence, any unclear person is written down. Not in words, on paper. Because paper remembers better than rumors. And this was the most important part of future statehood. Autumn brought not war, but pressure, from several sides at once. Caravans began to arrive late. In the south, one of the minor lords refused to recognize Stoneyard's tariff. Garen received a threat over the ford. Saren requested an expansion of the trading post due to the growing volume of trade. The forest carriers disappeared for a while and then reappeared even closer. Chiron understood. Someone was testing the boundaries of his power. Excellent. That means we are already large enough to be tested seriously. But inside, he felt fatigue. Not physical, architectural. He built and built and built, and now pressure was being applied to all the structures at once. And yet he was not going to retreat. When disputes began between Garen and Saren over part of the road and tolls, Chiron convened a large council under the roof of the main hall. Rain beat against the window. 3 maps lay on the table, and for the first time ever in one room sat Horn, Dorn, Roth, Rain, Garen, Sarn, and several more senior residents of Stoneyard. This was already almost the assembly of a small power. Garen grumbled that the southern tariffs were pressing on the northern income. Saren spoke of the strategic necessity of expanding his presence. Horn looked at all of this as if he were about to spit on the floor. Dorn was silent but calculating. Chiron listened, then said, "Enough." Everyone looked at him. Stoneyard will not become anyone's appendage. But it will not close itself off either. We offer everyone the same principle. There is access if it does not destroy our system. If you want to trade, trade. If you want to pass through, pass through. If you want to build trading posts, only outside the walls and without internal control. Saren narrowed his eyes. You are turning yourselves into a center that others will have to adjust to. Yes, Garen snorted. And it works. Chiron looked at them. Exactly. Because we no longer ask permission to exist. We build conditions. After the council, Saren remained alone with Chiron. He was silent for a long time. Then unexpectedly said, "You are not just a builder." Chiron did not answer. You are creating what is usually done only after a war. Order, hubs, laws, and you are doing it before you are forced to. It is cheaper. Saren smirked. It is more dangerous. For enemies, yes. The Lord looked at him attentively. If you continue at the same pace, you will either be destroyed, or you will have to become something greater than the Lord of a small fortress. Chiron looked at him for a long time. I am already moving toward that. It was not boasting. It was an admission. The broken arrow came with a letter, this time not from the forest, from inside. Chiron found it on his desk at noon. Small, neatly broken in half, with the same carving in the form of 3 notches. A note lay beside it, very short. Do not build higher than you can hold. Chiron looked at it for a long time. This was not a threat with a number and a signature. It was a warning from a person who knew his system, or thought he knew it. Horn, seeing the note, swore in a way he had not sworn even during the raid. Who is this? Chiron already understood that this was not the smugglers. It was someone who had been watching closely enough, someone who understood his methods, and someone who had now begun to fear. And an enemy's fear is a dangerous thing, because a cornered enemy strikes dirty. Chiron stood on the upper platform of the western tower. Below him, Stoneyard lived its large, already almost urban life. Caravans, the stove, the forge, the storehouse, the second wall, the craft school, the ford. Saren's trading post, trading houses, people, roads, and all of them rested on one principle. Structure is stronger than chaos. But now he understood for the first time that it was not enough for him simply to build a strong place. He needed to build a system that would not be broken by foreign interests, internal traders, and external lords. This was already the next level, and he was almost touching it. Almost. But it is precisely almost at such a point that things are most dangerous. Chiron gripped the railing and looked at the horizon. There, beyond the forest, beyond the river, beyond the ford, the larger world was already moving, and it was beginning to look back here. Stoneyard entered a new era. It stopped being just a settlement. It became a hub. Its neighbors recognized it. Traders came to it. Foreign interests reached toward it. And the more it grew, the closer a true siege became, not only of the walls, but of the very meaning of its existence. Chiron felt this, because every kingdom has a moment when it stops being a small victory and becomes someone's problem. Stoneyard had already approached that line, and that meant that what came next would not be just construction, What came next would be holding on, and possibly a real war for the right to exist.